Part 4 is going to move on to testing the logic. This is an important step in the process of validating what we've described in the evaporating cloud as being robust and sound enough for us to proceed to identifying assumptions. So I'm going to go through the basic logic tests. We're going to then apply those tests to our problem around marketing, and then we're going to summarize the results. So in terms of the basic tests, there are 7 of them. You can see that they're broadly divided up into 3 groups. The first one being testing the relationship between the entities A, B, B, D, A, C and C prime, and C and D prime. And we're just testing the veracity of that relationship and making sure that the wording hangs together as well as the logic. We're also testing that the conflict does exist and remains in place between D and D prime. And finally, there's a set of tests that look at it's a cross-check between D and C and D prime and B to make sure that both D and D prime compromise the requirements of C and B respectively. So one of the important things to note is that as we go through and modify some of these entities and their wording, that we recognize that it's often the case that each entity has 2 relationships, and in some cases 3, that needs to be recognized, so that we have to be careful that when changing something in order to make sure that one relationship is now improved, that we don't compromise some of the other relationships. So if we look at the diagram itself, you can see that entity A, the common objective, has 2 relationships with B and C, and therefore A must satisfy both of those in order to be robust. But it even becomes more complicated when we look at B and or C, where B's relationship is not only with D and A, but also with respect to D prime in terms of that compromise that I talked about earlier. And similarly, C is the same. C has a relationship with D prime and A, but also with D in terms of a compromise. So there's 3 relationships for both of those, and then 2 between these 2, 1, 2, and 1, 2. So what you have here is a slide that identifies down the page the different tests, 1, 2, 3 and so on. And across the top we can see that we describe the logic, the connectors that define the relationship between entities 1 and entity 2, and whether the result of testing those relationships is positive or not. If it fails, I've described the reasoning and what I propose to be an appropriate modification. So taking the first one, and as I said earlier, we need to read these out out loud to help check both the wording and the logic. I'll read it out loud, and it says, in order to maximum return to owners, the owner must. Owner has a greater influence on where and how the marketing campaign is run. So you can see that the wording doesn't hang together, it doesn't logically flow as it should, but more than that, there are other issues, and I describe them here. So what I've said is that entity A does not have an action verb, so the word maximum is not an action word, and why we need all the entities to have verbs is to help describe what we're trying to achieve. It's an ambition that we're seeking to achieve. We haven't solved the conflict yet, but we have a conflict because of these entities. So we want to use verbs to describe the actions that we believe are necessary. So we need to do that, but also I've suggested that the logic between A and B isn't compelling enough to justify the use of the word must. You can see here that the logical connector between entity A and B in all cases says the owner must. Must is mandatory. Must says that the logic has to be robust so that you can't have A unless you have B, right? That's the nature of necessary condition logic. And so I'm saying that in order for, putting aside the wording, in order for the owner to achieve maximum returns, the owner has to have a greater influence on where and how the marketing campaign is run. I'm saying that that's not strong logic, because what if the owner has no expertise in marketing? So how would he know where and how to influence the campaign? So I'm proposing to modify the wording. Firstly, in relation to A, to include a verb, so to replace the word maximum with maximize. And secondly, to modify B, to change it to a successful marketing campaign, to replace what's currently written. And the reason I propose that is because it becomes much clearer that in order to maximize the returns to the owner, there must be a successful marketing campaign. It's not really about whether the influence within the owner or for the owner exists or not. It's really whether the successful campaign exists or not. So let's move on to the second test, which is between entity B and D. And again, reading it out loud, in order to a successful marketing campaign, the owner must pay the marketing costs. Again, you can see the flow of words is not correct. This A becomes difficult. And secondly, I'm saying, and the reason I failed it primarily is because it's not immediately apparent why the owner must pay the marketing costs in order to have a successful marketing campaign. So again, the word must is giving me enough cause to suggest that this relationship is not strong. So my proposed modification is that at this stage it's not necessary to define who needs to pay the marketing campaign and why this would be necessary in order to have a successful marketing campaign. Therefore, at this stage I want to just modify D to pick up another specific issue, which is that we need to ensure that the marketing campaign is adequately funded, because it is clear that a successful marketing campaign requires funding in order to cover the cost of advertising online and offline. So the distinction I'm making here is the distinction between the timing of the cash flow, which is what I'm describing as funding, versus payment, which is the obligation to incur, which payment means I'll pay for it and I'm not seeking recompense from anyone else. So at this stage I'm saying the owner needs to ensure that there's funding so that the marketing campaign can be triggered and allowed to proceed, but that doesn't necessarily extend into suggesting that he will or she will pay for it in its final form. That's yet to be determined, and I want to leave that issue open until I've completed the tests on the other entities. So moving on to test 3, which is between the entities A and C. So we're now in the bottom half of the evaporating cloud. Again, we read out loud, in order to maximize returns to owner, the owner must, and C says, an incentivized agent with skin in the game. Well, again, the wording doesn't flow well. And secondly, the skin in the game term is open to interpretation. So we want to change that to make it a little bit more obvious what we're talking about. So I've proposed the change to entity C wording to say, engage a real estate agent that is willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability, to more accurately reflect a true need for A, and in particular, and particularly true if the owner has no expertise in the marketing. So why would a house owner engage a real estate agent? Well, mostly because they have networks in the marketplace of prospective buyers. They should be competent in marketing of a house, and so a house owner would engage a real estate agent for those reasons. So there's a pretty compelling reason why why they would want an agent, and in the second instance ensure that that agent is working in the best interests of the owner, and that's why we want one that was willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability. So moving on to the remaining tests, 4 to 7. The fourth test is around the relationship between C and D prime. So again, bearing in mind that we've changed entity C to the wording of engaging a real estate agent that is willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability, we can see that in order for that to exist, the owner don't pay the marketing costs, which is the way D prime is currently worded, but that again doesn't flow, so we need to change the wording of entity 2, and that wording needs to change to not pay the marketing costs. So it now reads, in order to engage a real estate agent that is willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability, the owner must not pay the marketing costs. Now logically and from a wording perspective flows well. So the next two tests are the ones around compromise or jeopardy, and you can see here that it's a cross check. So what we're saying is that D must compromise C. So the question is, does having the house owner fund the marketing costs compromise our ability to engage a real estate agent that is willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability? And I say that it does. That's why I've passed or given it a tick in terms of the test, and said that, you know, one could well argue that if we want an agent to have responsibility and accountability, they should fund the marketing cost, not the house owner. So that's why I've given it a tick. And similarly, in respect to D prime and B, you'll recall that B was about the owner having a greater influence on where and how the marketing campaign is run. We've changed that. We changed that to having a successful marketing campaign, and it arguably is compromised when we don't have the house owner fund the marketing costs, because if the house owner doesn't adequately fund the marketing costs, then it could be argued that there will be compromise in respect to the requirement of having a successful marketing campaign, because there's not sufficient funds to allow that campaign to proceed. So moving on to the final test, which is to validate that the conflict between D and D prime is direct and real. You can see that I applied this test to the current wording and came to the conclusion that it failed. And the primary reason was that, you'll remember in an earlier test we changed the wording in D to from pay to fund, and we didn't make the same change when we looked at D prime. So there's a distinction currently between these two statements, and we now need to remove that ambiguity because it's clear that fund and pay mean something different, and even if they didn't, it would be an unnecessary confusion for the reader. So I'm proposing that we need to use the word fund in both instances. So my proposal is to change D prime to adequately fund the marketing costs, and to change D to not fund the marketing costs, and that's really just a wording issue. The word fund remains the same. So if we take all of those changes and we incorporate those into a revision to the evaporating cloud, this is what we end up with. And what we do is one final check to make sure that it logically is robust and the wording flows as we want it to. So we'll read it out loud, starting with the relationship between A and B. So in order to, using this wording, in order to maximise returns to the house owner, we must have, or the owner must have, a successful marketing campaign. Well, that sounds logical, because without a marketing campaign, the prospective buyers are not going to know that the house is indeed even on the market. So the owner needs that marketing campaign, and that marketing campaign needs to be successful because returns to the house owner will be based on there being more than one bidder for that house. And so a successful marketing campaign will have that as a requirement, that it creates a competitive environment, that there's tension required by two or more potential bidders, and that there's a conclusion reached within a timely fashion so that it doesn't drag on and on. These are all necessary requirements of a successful marketing campaign, and it's covered by these things here, or this relationship here. We move on and look now to validate the relationship between B and D. We start with saying in order to have a successful marketing campaign, the owner must adequately fund the marketing costs. And again, our logic is that you can have a campaign, but if you don't fund it, you're not going to get that campaign delivering as intended. And whilst there may be a dispute about the payment of it, the final payment of it, the owner must take responsibility for ensuring that the funding doesn't become an issue, that the cash flow is there to ensure that the marketing campaign can be triggered and continue to work. So now let's look at the bottom line of logic and see whether that is both appropriate from a wording point of view and logical. And we can start by testing that by saying in order to maximise returns to the house owner, the owner must engage a real estate agent that is willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability. So the wording sounds right. The logic sounds pretty compelling too, because the owner doesn't necessarily have expertise in real estate. An agent comes with the skills required to sell real estate and to market it appropriately, and a network. So all of those requirements need to be embedded in a real estate agent, but what's being proposed here is over and above that, we want that agent to accept responsibility for the marketing and the accountability of it, because that's part and parcel of the role of the agent. So that's the main argument, and that's covered, encapsulated in that wording. And then test 4, in order to engage a real estate agent that is willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability, the owner must not fund the marketing costs. Again, that wording flows well, and also it's logically compelling, because we're saying if we've got a real estate agent that is accepting marketing responsibility and accountability, that should extend through to the funding of the marketing costs. So we see these things going hand in hand. So there's no reason why anyone else should fund marketing if the agent is accepting that responsibility. So all of that looks good. We can see that these two are in conflict, i.e. adequately fund the marketing costs versus not fund the marketing costs. It's clear that those two are in conflict. So the final two tests are whether D prime compromises C and whether D compromises B. So the question here is, if the owner does not fund the marketing costs, can there still be a successful marketing campaign? And the argument being presented so far is that no, because if there's a dispute about the funding, then it's likely that the campaign will not proceed. It will not be triggered, and it won't continue because there's insufficient funds to support that campaign. So there is a potential compromise here. And similarly, this one here, if we want to engage a real estate agent that's willing to accept marketing responsibility and accountability, then should the owner adequately fund the marketing costs? And again, we say, well, if the agent is going to assume responsibility, then if the owner then pays that marketing or funds the marketing costs, is the agent really accepting that responsibility? And again, we would say no, there's a compromise there. So those two tests we would give a tick to. So a summary of those tests I've presented here, and I think that at this stage, and certainly for the purposes of this this course, the logic hangs together well enough for us to now move on to the next step in the process.